Well, I have a story I want to share this morning about tobogganing. It's perfect weather for telling a story about tobogganing. So I was trying to think, how am I going to introduce a story about tobogganing when it's... I mean, no one wants to think about that. Anyways, it's a story I remember as a kid. We used to go tobogganing quite a bit in my teen years. There was another group of brothers that were, when we came to the church, they were in the church there, and we go together. And I remember this one, well, there's two events, but this one particular day, there had been an ice storm the day before. And it was like so fast going down the hill. It was amazing. But we didn't get to go that many times because it was really hard to get up the hill. As we were climbing the hill, you had to look for that little rough patch of ice. If it was smooth, you couldn't put your foot there. So you're looking for the little rough patches to get a little bit of grip. And even if you flinch, well, you lost your balance, you let go of your sled, boom, way you go down. But the few runs we got, they were really fun. Now, what would happen? That's just tobogganing, so you don't get as many runs in. Okay, whatever. But let's say you had to climb that ice hill, and at the bottom there was a cliff, all right, a drop-off, and you're going to die. And it was a life-or-death situation. I mean, now, where you place your next foot, every step makes a difference whether you live or die. And so maybe you don't want to go first, so you watch the person in front of you, and you're like, now, I want you to picture the scenario a little different. Let's say you have a parent at the top of the hill, and they're saying, I got up, this is how, step here, step there, and they threw down some cleats you could put on or whatever. I mean, just picture a parent trying to guide you or an expert trying to guide you. Now, if you're climbing the hill and your parent's telling you what to do, and now let's add a third individual there, a friend who's distracting you, talking. They're like, don't you care about my joke? Look at me when I'm talking to you. And they're trying to get your attention away from where you're stepping. And the parent's saying, don't listen to them. They're bad. They're trying to make you die. And they're saying, don't listen to your parents. Look at me. I'm walking. It's easy. The parent would be happy if their child listened to them, took their advice, and followed the steps where they need to go without being distracted. But that other person who was a friend, the parent would want them to turn to the friend. The reason why I put this scenario out there is that's kind of what it's like when we're walking in our lives, the walk of faith. God already knows how to finish the walk, finish the race, and He's telling you how to do it as a father to a son. But then you've got this person walking with you in this earth, this father of lies, who's the deceiver, who tells you he's your friend. And he's trying to distract you. Get your eyes off of that. And he's pretending to be your friend, and he's distracting you, and he's trying to deceive you so that when you fall down the hill off the cliff, it will hurt God. That's kind of the relationship that we're dealing with on earth. There is, in Ephesians, Paul's been telling us about these spiritual forces of evil at work, and we tend to forget about it because we can't see it. Just because you can't see something doesn't mean it's not there. I mean, there's a lot of things like gravity. We don't see gravity, and we don't really think about it every day. It's just there. It's just part of life. Doesn't mean it's not real. I mean, even what your body does without thinking about it. I never really thought about, thinking about breathing until I needed a sleep app machine at night. I'm like, oh man, how does my body just know to do that? There's certain things that we don't think about much. The amount of oxygen that comes into your body. You need oxygen to help with your blood and to stay alive, and if you don't get enough oxygen, there's problems. Well, we don't think about the oxygen. We just think about breathing air in and carbon dioxide breathing out. You don't think about what's going in and how it's happening. So when it comes to spiritual things, God wants us to be aware. There's a story that I'd like to go over to illustrate this a different way maybe. I'm surprised. Many of us we've heard this story since we're kids. For those of you who are familiar with this story, good. You'll familiarize yourself even more this morning. But there are so many people, Jesus says, go into the world and teach them, help them. So this is an amazing story to bring to the world. We go through it a lot. We're like, let's find other stories. No, this is a very important story. And this is a story about a young man named David. Some of you are familiar with this story. David had 7 brothers. 3 of his oldest brothers were out at war. The Israelites were at war with the Philistines. And they were each on these 2 hills, and there was this little valley between them. And this giant came out. And he had a suggestion. And he said, he comes out from the army, and he says, choose one of your men and have him come down against me. If he wins in a fight and kills me, we'll be your servants. But if I win, you'll serve us. In other words, why do all this battling where there's so many casualties? Let's just do, you take your best, we'll take our best. Whoever wins, the other one surrenders. And as they looked at the size and experience of this warrior, it said they lost their courage and were terrified. David's 3 brothers, the oldest 3 brothers who were good, valiant fighters, were terrified. This went on for 40 days. Anybody today? Anybody? And then in this story, this is the giant's described. He's described as over 9.5 feet tall. His armor was 125 pounds, just the armor on his body. And his spear, the end of his spear was 50 pounds, the spearhead. I mean, this guy is a giant of a man. We're not just talking about, tall, maybe not, lanky basketball player or something like that. This guy's like a monster. And he is a trained warrior. So the story goes that this guy steps forward, he challenges them for 40 days. And as his brothers are out there, David's father, he's concerned for these 3 brothers. And so he says to David one day, David's the youngest, he's a shepherd. He says, leave the sheep with someone else. Here's I packed a lunch for the boys. Go and bring it to them and tell me how things are going. It's been a long time. Is anybody willing to stand up? Go and check on your brothers. And when David arrives with his lunch for his brothers, he leaves the lunch. He left the supplies and he runs up into the battle line to see what's going on. He asks his brothers how they are. And while he was speaking with them, this champion steps forward. I defy the armies of Israel. And he goes on. Is there anybody? He goes on with this chant, challenging them. And David's shocked. How come this is going on so long? He's speaking poorly about God's army. We're God's people. And David said, who is this Philistine that we should that he should defy the armies of the living God? David knows who he worships. He worships the one and only living God. The Philistines don't have him. The Israelites do. So why are they all afraid? King Saul hears of this, and he brings David to him. I guess there was no one else who had the faith of David. And Saul says, David said to the king, this is the king, don't let anyone be discouraged. I'll go and fight this Philistine. And this king replies, you can't fight. You're just a youth, and he's been a warrior since he's been young. Son, you're overconfident. I appreciate your faith. Go on. David doesn't accept that. David says, listen, when a lion or a bear came and attacked the lamb, I struck it down. This Philistine will be like one of them. He has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, he will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. His speech must have just got to the heart of the king, and the king's like, well, he was probably desperate too. And he's like, okay, go. May God be with you, son. I mean, no one else is going to step up. Guess we stand a better chance with the faith of this young guy. No, Saul probably wasn't just doubting. Saul had faith himself. He was good when he was first king. So Saul wants to make sure this young man is well prepared. Saul gives him the best armor that anyone could ask for, his own. Son, take my armor. Take my weapons. Go into battle as I would. David puts them on. And David says, he's not used to armor. He's a shepherd. He says, I can't fight. This is going to actually be harder for me to fight. Helmet's probably in his eye. He's not used to it. He says, I'll go with what I fought, that lion and bear. He takes his stick and his sling with some stones from the riverbed, and he goes down to fight the giant. And as he's walking down the hill, he's coming down the hill, and Goliath sees him. And he's insulted. He says, am I a dog that you send a boy with some sticks? He's looking at the staff, thinking he's going to throw him a stick. Go fetch. He's insulted by this young man, and Goliath says, "You're dead." And David says, "The God that you are defying is with me, and he will see you fall today." Paraphrasing. You can go and read the rest of that story. And that's what happens. David fights the giant, and he throws the sling around with one of the stones in it. The stone hits the giant between the eyes, sinks deep into his head, not because of the strength of David, because of the strength of his God. And the giant falls. It's not just a story of a young man versus a big giant. This is a story of God versus believers in God versus believers in a false no God. Spiritual realm, the one and only true God versus the evil that's in the world that wants, the demons that want people to worship anything but God. The creek bed is still there. The valley of Elah here today, you can go and drive by and stop your car and go out and visit that location where this battle happened. Took place, Saul's army and the army of the Philistines on one side, and you can go there today. It's pretty neat. Real story happened. Now, David was a man after God's own heart. David had a lot of things happen in his life after he beat the giant. And David ended up, people were singing songs about him. They sung a song about the king. Saul has slain thousands. He's a good king. David, tens of thousands. Saul got jealous because David was doing so much. David was able to marry the king's daughter. David was in charge of the army. David was so successful, Saul became jealous. Saul hunted him down. David found himself on the run. And if we look at David's life while he's on the run from Saul, he is still praising and confident in his God. The story of David you see in the Old Testament, but you also see David is responsible for many of the Psalms. If you're reading in the Psalms, most of them are from David. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. That is David. And you're reading of David's heart. My heart is confident, my heart is confident. I will sing praises. I will praise you, Lord, amongst the people. God, be exalted above the heavens. Let your glory be over the whole earth. Even when he's on the run, even when things are not going well, he's praising God. He's glorifying God. He is a man of faith. He's the only one strong enough, willing to step up against the giant. And if you look at his life, he fights the giant. He's responsible for many psalms. And then he's on the run from Saul. And he meets Nabal and marries Abigail. He's also married to Michal. And there were some problems that came from all that, but that's for another time. David ends up living in the cities of the Philistines. David's anointed king. David becomes king. He goes and settles in Jerusalem where he builds a palace. He brings the ark into Jerusalem. And you look at David's life when he fought the giant. David was probably in his teenage years, between 15 and 20 years old. And when he settles in his palace and the ark has come and he's finally settling down, he's probably in his 40s or 50s. 20 years have gone by. Strong, faithful young man who loses his focus. He takes his eyes off of the path he's supposed to be putting his feet on. He puts his guard down. He takes off his armor, so to speak, and he forgets that the giant he battled 20 years ago, it wasn't about that physical giant. That there was a giant that he was battling, and he's still battling against him, and God was there, and that is Satan, the father of lies, who's out to get all of us. That's the giant that was battling David, and David learned a lesson one day as he went out on his palace, and he looked out while everyone else was at war, and he's looking at his life, and he notices this woman bathing on the roof. And he says, as he looks out, he says, "Who is she?" And this is found in 2 Samuel. In the springs when the kings march out to war, David sent Joab with his officers. And one evening he got up from his bed and strolled around on the roof of his palace. From the roof he saw a woman bathing, a very beautiful woman. So David sent someone to inquire about her. And he said, "Isn't this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" Or Hittite. David, walk back into your room. So you have closed the curtain and walk away. David's guard was down. So what did he do? Who is she? You inquire. And that's how temptation works, and we're going to read that passage in a minute. As a matter of fact, I'm going to this temptation passage first. Here's how temptation works. God doesn't tempt us. God doesn't tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away and enticed by his own evil desire. It draws you and lures you. And then, as you give in to your evil desires, it's conceived and it gives birth to sin. And that gives birth to death. Drawn away, in other words, says, you're entangled by that web. You can't take your eyes off. And you walk closer and closer. We're also reading 1 Corinthians chapter 10. No temptation has come upon you, has seized you, except what's common. God is faithful. He won't let you be tempted beyond what you're able to bear. And when you are tempted, he will provide a way out. David, when you're on that roof and when you're looking, you need to quickly recognize that and say, okay, I got to walk away. But that's not what happened. David sent messengers to, who is she? And then bring her to me. And then David ended up sleeping with her, committing adultery, which he knew was wrong. And she sends word back, I am pregnant. David's got a big problem now. One of his own men, a good man in his army, his wife's expecting a baby and he's off at war. And David's going to get found out. This great, mighty leader, spiritual leader, this warrior, he's done so much, and his name will be tarnished. God will look bad. This is going to be a real problem. He knows he's made a mistake, and so what does he try to do? Fix a mistake with the mistake. I know what I'll do. I'll get him to come back from war and pretend that I'm interested and he's a messenger. He'll go home, sleep with his wife, and, she'll have a baby 9 months later, and then he'll think it's his baby. There's no DNA testing. It's not like today when you can, just check DNA and stuff like that. And so David calls back Uriah. How's things going out there? How you doing? What's going on? Give me some. Everything's. Go home and have a good night tonight and go back tomorrow. But Uriah is such a good man that he goes home and he thinks, I should be out at war. This isn't fair. How is it fair that I get to come back to the city and I get to have a nice meal and I get to go home and be with my family and be with my wife? You know what? That's not fair to all those others. I'm going to sleep like they are out on the dirt. And he doesn't go home. He stays outside and sleeps out in the dirt. Of course, David's really concerned. Oh, no. What am I going to do? So what does David do? You know what? I'll get him drunk. If he's drunk and we have a little bit of a party, he'll go home and surely he'll sleep with his wife. He has a party. He invites Uriah, come on. And come on back one more night. One more night. And Uriah, even in a state of drunkenness, will not sleep with his wife. He says, I cannot do such a thing. He's a good man. So David's got a real problem on his hands. So what David does next, and for those of you who read the story, David writes a letter, and back then you'd have the king would have a ring with a seal, and you'd press it in the wax, and so you know it hasn't been opened. He sealed this letter, and he sent it with Uriah, bring this to your commander. Be careful with it. And in that letter, as the commander gets the letter and opens it, he sees what it says, and the commander's probably shocked. As it says, send all the men up to the front lines where the fighting is fierce. Right on the wall where the arrows are coming down, they're pouring, boiling oil, whatever they're doing, where it's the fighting is worse. Call them all back, but don't tell Uriah. In other words, have Uriah killed. Not only did Uriah suffer for David's sin, but all those other men who were fighting in the battle that day, so many others lost their lives because David trying to hide his sin. That's how sin works. Who do you think is happy that day? The evil one. He was still at war, that giant battling David, and he's looking at all the destruction that's happening and all the problems that are going on, and he's happy, I'm sure. So David has Uriah killed, and of course the next day the prophet Nathan comes to David. And he tells a story about a man who has one little sheep, poor man. And he raises up that sheep as his own pet. It was a part of his family, like a child. And the wealthy king had thousands of sheep, and some visitors were coming from out of town. And again, I'm paraphrasing, so you can go home and read it. And the king doesn't want to use one of his sheep. You don't want to lose any money on your own sheep. Find someone who has a sheep. There's a little one, there's a nice lamb. Let's take that man's lamb and sacrifice that lamb. And David is furious. What king would do? Whoever did this, he must die. And Nathan said, God said, that's you. You had everything. And if you wanted more, God would have given it to you. But you took someone else's wife, which you were not supposed to do. And you're going to suffer for this. And that's when David pours out his heart in a psalm. I'm going to come back to this. Psalm 51. David recognizes his guilt and his sin. Be gracious to me, God, according to your faithful love. He knows God's love. According to your abundant compassion, he knows God's compassion. Completely wash away my guilt and cleanse me from my sin. Create in me a clean heart, God. Renew a steadfast spirit within me. Lord, open my lips and my mouth will declare your praise. He felt like he couldn't even talk to God. He just feels so far and so down and so away from God. Like that's how sin works for all of us. We just feel so guilty and I can't talk to you, Lord. Sacrifice pleasing to God is a broken spirit. You will not despise a broken and humble heart. He breaks his spirit. He humbles his heart. He falls down and repents. He had to pay for that sin. There was consequences. Justice said there was consequences. He had a rough life after that. But God is a merciful and compassionate God and a forgiving God. You see, God doesn't want any of us lost to that giant, to the evil one. And Satan and the evil forces have been at war with us for a long time, and even with Israel. You go back and look at the challenges of, that wasn't Moses versus Pharaoh. That was the Egyptian people worshiping demons, other gods who weren't real, versus the one true God who Moses comes and introduces to the Egyptians and reminds the Israelites he is there. And those plagues were plagues against the Egyptian gods. And guess what? In the book of Isaiah, there would be judgment against God's people because they continually fail. And the Assyrians were going to come and take them away, and the Babylonians would come and take them away. That was God's judgment on his own people to open their eyes. And they continually fail, just as David. And so you know what God says as he tells Isaiah the prophet to reveal to his people? He saw there was no one. The Lord saw there was no justice, and he was offended. He saw there was no man. He was amazed that there was no one interceding. No one worthy enough to lead his people. So what does God do? So by his own arm he brought salvation. Just like he did with Egypt, he's planning to do it again. This is looking forward at that time. By his own righteousness supported him. He put on the righteousness as a body armor, the helmet of salvation on his head, and garments of vengeance for clothing. Helmet of salvation. Breastplate of righteousness. Way back in the Old Testament. And this is a famous passage that comes to mind as we come to Ephesians chapter 6 this morning, because that giant is still facing us today. And Paul says, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against rulers, authorities, cosmic powers of darkness, against evil spiritual forces in heaven. For this reason, take up the full armor of God, so that you can be able to resist in evil day, and having prepared everything, take your stand. It's your turn to battle the evil one. David had his time, David had his success and his failures, and now it's your time. God was the armor behind David at that time. God has given us his armor today. Just as King Saul said, take my best, even the human's best armor doesn't do it. You need God. And God gives us his armor today through Jesus. he tells us to put on his armor. His breastplate of righteousness. Not the righteousness that we have earned ourselves. This is the righteousness that we get from Jesus. Because salvation is only found in Jesus. Take Jesus. Accept him into your lives. Commit your lives to him. Be cleansed of your sin. For it's his righteousness that will make us stand. The helmet of the breastplate of righteousness, like armor. Belt of truth. When you look at the importance of truth. Jesus said, "For this reason I have come into the world to testify to the truth." Who is it that we're battling? The father of lies. Truth is important. It holds together your armor like a belt. We think of belt holding up your pants, right? And if you're wearing a robe, it will keep your robe closed. It holds things together. Truth needs to be your guide. Listen to the Father at the top of the hill telling you what to do, not the father of lies trying to deceive and distract you. The helmet of salvation, the belt of truth, the helmet of salvation, the knowledge, knowing that you have been saved, knowing the worst that can happen to you is death. Satan doesn't want you to die when you're faithful. I mean, then you're gone home to be with God. He's lost the opportunity to pull you away from God. Death is not the worst thing for the believer. And remember that we have that salvation. The belt of truth, the shield of faith. The shield of faith which can extinguish the flaming arrows of the evil one. The evil one is continually trying to attack us. Trying to attack our families. Trying to drive doubt and dissension among us. The church, trying to destroy the church. Trying to get us to at each other's throats. Greed and criticisms and judgments, and trying to divide us and get us apart. Make us look down on what God has designed. Families, church family. And yes, there's problems and mistakes and we don't do things right, but if it's done right, it's still a glorious thing. If you think there's problems with your church family, instead of just walking away saying, you know what, I'm done with this, try and help and fix it. We're broken people, we need help. Stop just pointing and criticizing, say, I'm going to do something to help. That's like looking at the army and saying, look at all these weak people and walking away. No, you put your armor on, you stand up and say, look, this is how to fight. And so we fight with the sword of the Spirit. Having God's armor isn't just about me. Thank you, God, for your armor. I'm going to wear it today. Lord, help me to wear it to be strong. God doesn't just want you to have his armor on so that you can just kind of be protected as you walk around. God gives you the sword of the Spirit, which is the word, to attack. You see, God uses us to fight evil. If you're not out there fighting evil, rescuing others and helping others, you're not a part of the army. The army that God has is an army that also fights. And so, submit to God, put his armor on. Hear about his ways. Have feet fitted with readiness to go into the world, and the sword that you can go and attack the evil one. Draw near to God, he will draw near to you. Purify your hearts, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. We are not powerless against the evil one. And so, the challenge this morning is to recognize that giant that David fought is still here today. We will have our ups and downs, but when you look at David's life, he recognized God. He didn't give up on his faith when he was at his lowest. And you know what God says about David in the New Testament? He was a man after my own heart. Because what does God want? God wants all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and he wants a broken and humble spirit. May we be a people of God. May we be warriors in his army, and may we not lose our focus as our Father calls us on the path of truth, the path of safety in life. That we recognize the evil one and recognize our weaknesses and recognize the one who knows everything and what to follow and who to follow. Let's stand as we sing our final hymn.